Hey, everyone. Welcome to the last episode of season 2 for At the Table. And oh my goodness, you have one of my favorite people on the planet that you get to hear from today, Karen Swallow Pryor. Thank you so much, sister, for joining me today.
Thank you, Jackie. It's such an honor to see your face and talk to you officially on the air live. Well, not really live, but it's great to be here.
Yes, absolutely. And goodness, you are one of my dearest friends, dearest encouragers, and I think examples. And so I cannot think of a better person to kind of wrap up this episode and talk about women in leadership and specifically like public theologians and right in the middle of culture and all of the things happening. And honestly, you are that person and you're doing it well. You're doing it humbly, although I know it hasn't been an easy road. So we are going to be talking all things chapter 10 of my book, In the Calling of Eve, and Karen is going to be able to just spread some light, maybe even kind of pull back the curtain of some of the beauties and hardships of what it means to be a woman in the public sphere. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, just some get to know you's family, where you're recording from, all of those fun things.
Sure. So I am recording from my home in central Virginia in the foothills of the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. Today, I know this is airing in the winter, but today it's about 90 degrees. It's pretty hot. So, but I do love the hot Virginia weather, so I'm good. I actually have spent 35 years teaching English at the college level. That's, has been my main vocation and profession. I grew up in a Christian home, accepted Christ as a little girl, and so grew up in the church and had such a strong and solid foundation, which I'm really thankful for because these have been some tough times, and really just carved out for myself through God's providence and I think his plan, kind of an integration of my passion for literature, my passion for teaching, and my Christian faith, and just kind of putting them all together, which is also what has brought me into the sphere of culture, because, literature teaches you about everything and different kinds of people and situations. And so for me, it's all together in one big pot: my Christian faith, literature, culture, and so I just kind of live out the way I think and read and write, and that's what I do.
So thankful for you. And tell us about Roy. How long have y'all been married?
We have been married 38 years, so, coming up on 39, obviously, if you can do the math. And we live here in this old house in Virginia. We don't have any children, but my parents live here. Roy built them a house in the backyard, and it's been such a blessing to have them here for the past, it's been quite a few years now, and to journey with them through their old age. And it's been such a wonderful blessing.
It is. It's such a beautiful life. And your pups. I know we have to at the end of the show, point everybody to your Twitter and your Instagram so that they can see pictures of your garden and pictures of your daily runs and the pups, because who doesn't want really cute pictures of dogs that are sleeping really cozily?
I wish I could get like really nice pictures of them looking like beautiful dogs as they are, but like all I can get is them sleeping, because that's pretty much what they do.
I love it. It's the personality. And really, that's what we all want to be, right? Is
exactly
sitting up on the couch sleeping.
Pretty much.
Oh, I love it. Well, it's very true. Like God has taken you on a journey and is using you in some incredible ways. And so I think one of the things that I would love to start off on is, really, whenever you got on my radar, it was literature, and your books kind of on reading well and taking classic literature and what you can learn from those different genres and writing and all of that. But then as I was following you from that, your voice was on the Washington Post or in the New York Times, and you are this solid faith believer that is saying really hard things in a cultural moment that honestly ended up making like one side mad at you and the other side mad at you. Like you couldn't make anybody happy. And specifically in chapter 10, I talk about Huldah, and I think of you because there's so much of her example with King Josiah to where they go to her. They could have gone to Jeremiah was a contemporary, Zephaniah was a contemporary, but they go to Huldah. They find the woman. And she doesn't shrink back on, hey, let me make sure that these are sugar-coated words. She gave the word of God. She gave truth. And so when I think of you, and as I'm watching you lead, as I'm watching you take hits from both sides, there is just such this example of your dedication to the Word of God, to being a truth teller, no matter what the hits are. So can you maybe kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us what it's like to, you are boldly proclaiming that life matters from the womb all the way to being buried and celebrated in life. And I mean, you're tackling sexual abuse and just all kinds of hard issues that you don't have to. So I think my first question is why? And then my second question is, how do you handle like making everybody mad? I'm sure is what it feels like.
It does. And I mean, I wish I had a confident answer in that. All I can do is kind of like guess. And I think there are a few things that I can look to. First of all, I think that the main answer is, I've taken, a number of those different spiritual gifts tests. I think we've all done that. And I do have the gift of teaching. It's not something that I chose. But I'm on fire as a teacher. I actually resisted being a teacher for a long time until I discovered that's what God made me to do. But even stronger than my gift of teaching is the gift of prophecy. And prophecy, I'm sure your listeners know, prophecy isn't like fortune telling. Prophecy is truth telling, right? It's being able to see through, the confusion and the haze and just point to what's true and what is right and what's wrong. So I have that gift, and it's not even something that I chose. It's not even something, I just learned, early in adulthood that I am restless if I don't speak out the truth as I see it, even if it costs something. And so I've done that, as you said, on a number of issues from the time of being a young adult. I think what makes it a little bit easier for me is just my life circumstances, in that I grew up in the secular Northeast as a Christian, and none of my friends were Christians. It's a very secular society. So I was always kind of an outsider in that way. I was not, a popular kid. I wasn't the least popular. I wasn't the most popular. So I just never had it easy in terms of like fitting in and finding people who agree with me. And then when I shifted, I moved to the South, lived in the Bible Belt, became involved publicly in church life, and started getting more attacks from, fellow believers for a number of reasons. Then it just, it was the other side, but it was kind of the same. So I guess I've just, I have the gift of prophecy, the gift of teaching. Those are my passions, whether I want them or not. And I'm accustomed throughout my life to just sort of not quite fitting in. I'm also like double-handed. I use right-handed, left hand. I'm right brain, left brain. So I don't know. I'm either very balanced or very unbalanced. So that helps.
Yes, I can see that. And I think even for all of us, even just being a woman leader, I think there's an element of feeling a little bit like an outsider, because there's not maybe those natural pathways, there's not those natural avenues that we've been able to follow and kind of forging our own way. But you really are one of those women that have forged a lane for so many of us kind of coming behind. And there are personal costs to that. And so I'm wondering, like, how have you had to wrestle through, even I think as I look back, 2016 and elections and just the temperature that things have really kind of heated up on so many levels, like so many things are polarizing. So what has that looked like for you, even being confident in this is the word of, like, this is truth, but there's still an identity element to that, to where it's like, well, wait a second, I'm not in this group and I'm not in that group. And these are supposed to be my people. These are supposed to be family, brothers and sisters in Christ. And yet they're the ones that are flinging mud at me. So how have you maybe had to wrestle out just calling an identity, knowing full well, like, this is what God has called me to do, but that doesn't make you less human, doesn't make you less fleshy, right? So I don't know if that's a word, but like, and I think as I look at you, you're still so tender and loving and compassionate to people. So maybe kind of walk us through, like, how do you still stay tenderhearted, even though you're giving some pretty hard truths to people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think again, when I look at what you just described about how the church is, in the past few years, it's just been fracturing and polarizing. And, I don't think, I know I didn't see it coming. I think a lot of us didn't see it coming. And if I could look back and, go back 10 years and see what I would have to face and go through now, I might have just like avoided it altogether, but it didn't really happen that way. It happened relatively slowly and gradually. But when I was a Christian living in a secular environment, I was kind of used to being criticized or attacked by people who didn't agree with me, that were, outside the church or, different politically, especially because I became very passionate about the abortion issue early on. So I was used to being attacked and hated and criticized. And then when it was, people in the church who were attacking and hating and criticizing, I had this experience in practice of being targeted, but it was really disorienting. I had no idea Christians did that to one another. I did not know. And part of that is just, I think a fruit of the digital age and social media. I get that, but I still, that doesn't explain brothers and sisters in Christ treating one another that way. So it's been very disorienting. I mean, and it's been, it's been hard, but it's also, I learn a lot through it. Like, I really do listen to most critics, or at least weigh what they say, because I can always learn. Like, if I'm trying to give a message, and say a truth, and it's not being received, I mean, sometimes people they're not going to receive it. But sometimes I think, well, what is it how could I get this message across better? And that doesn't mean, that's true if it's a reader of the New York Times who hates my politics on abortion, or if it's, a fundamentalist Theo bro who just thinks that I'm apostate or something. I can learn from them. But the other thing, and I guess I wouldn't be me if I didn't preach this, reading literature all my life has just exercised my empathy muscles, my perspective abilities. And sometimes it's actually a curse, but mostly I think it's a gift, that I can try to see things from someone else's perspective. I don't agree with them, but I can kind of see maybe where they're coming from, or understand their point of view. Now that does become a curse, in the sense that I think that I have sometimes, and this is, a more recent, I think, understanding, is that has allowed me to overlook too much. Like, sometimes I just, excuse away or give the most charitable interpretation of things. And if I've erred in any way, that's probably where I've erred, because I've been too slow, maybe sometimes, to see within the church family, error and evil that needs to be reckoned with, in the same way that I would reckon with the errors and evils outside the church.
What a humble answer. And a good reminder, I think, to all of us that there is something to learn. And I think being your friend, being your sister, like, that is very much probably the predominant thing that I have learned from you, is just your commitment, I think, to understand people well, to speak well, to represent Christ well. And you do the work. And I remember a phone call to where I was all up in a tiz, calling you and upset. And you were such a gracious, peace, I think, in that moment, to remind me of God's in control, and we don't have to defend, and we don't have to, have all of the right answers and things. And I think in this current culture, that is so contrary to what is expected of most people, to come out defending or to, take down and those kind of things. And so I appreciate that wisdom, not only in that moment, but even today for our listeners. And I think it's a great segue into your new book that launched in August. And goodness, this thing is pointed and needed, and it's speaking to the very things that you're talking about. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your new book and what led you to writing it?
Yeah, the book is called The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. And it really comes from my classroom teaching. It's been sort of a brainchild of mine, gestating for a number of years. And it started because I teach a lot of Victorian literature in the Victorian age. really was sort of the peak of the influence of the early evangelical movement. And the Victorians emphasized masculine and feminine roles, the separate spheres for women, family, duty, earnestness, loyalty, lots of good things. But at the same time, they had sort of a dirty underside, the dark side of those things. And in particular, a lot of my students who grew up in evangelical subculture would read some of the literature that which emphasizes a lot the sexual double standard, that women had to be sexually pure, but for men it was, okay. I mean, the writers would be addressing these things. Or there's a famous poem called "The Angel in the House" that puts the wife on a pedestal and calls her and sees her as an angel. And my students would point out, like, that's kind of how they grew up, in the 20th and 21st century. And so I would begin to ask them, I said, well, is this idea or this principle or this teaching or this concept biblical, or is it just Victorian? And so that kind of just, they were very intrigued by that. I tweeted about it a few times, and I thought, evangelical 21st century American evangelical culture has been influenced a lot by Victorian culture. Now, at root, oftentimes there are biblical truths and ideas, but regardless of which culture is influencing us, we as Christians, no matter where or when we live, it is our duty to distinguish between what is biblical and what is simply cultural. And so the whole book is kind of devoted to identifying what I see as sort of the main metaphors and stories and concepts of evangelicalism from the 18th century until now, how they started, what was good about them, why they're important, but also how they can kind of go wrong when we emphasize them too much or we sacrifice something else to emphasize those.
Yeah. Well, and tell me a little bit about the title, because I think the title is very unique. And I think you're also trying to communicate something in that as well, as the wordsmith you are. So tell me a little bit about just kind of that overarching idea of imagination and how we've lost that in our culture.
Yeah. Well, the book is, I do write a little bit in the beginning about the imagination and how important it is and how it reflects our being made in the image of God. But then I make a link to what the book is really about. And it is a concept that Charles Taylor, the Catholic philosopher, talks, and other philosophers and thinkers talk about, called the social imaginary. And a social imaginary is really just sort of our collective pool of stories and narratives and visions for the good life that we don't really think about consciously, but they're actually underneath the surface, kind of driving our thoughts. And this is true for all of us. A good example that I like to use, and I mention it in the book, but it's helpful, is just the idea of the American dream. We might not talk about it, we might not say it, but the concept of the American dream is so pervasive in our culture that it does often set our expectations about what success looks like, or whether we should, what our, housing situation should look like, what our family should look like. And there's nothing inherently wrong with the American dream, but if we don't think about it and interrogate it, then it can skew our vision for the good life. It can skew our expectations. I remember, Roy and I married so young, and we've been married so long, but we struggled financially. I was in school and all these things. We both came from, but he came from a poorer family. I came from a working class family. And so we struggled, as many people do. And I just remember always feeling less than and feeling like a failure because we'd been married a number of years and hadn't bought a house. We were still renting and moving from here to there. Now, I know this is much more common today, unfortunately, for young people, but this was during a time whenever, all my friends were buying their first homes. And I don't know I just remember one day before the Lord just saying, why do I feel like a failure? Like, maybe we aren't ever going to buy a house, or maybe it's just going to take forever. And why do I feel like we're living faithfully, we're working hard, we're good stewards, and we're trying to lean into what we believe our calling of the Lord is. And so why am I letting this make me be upset or feel less than? And I just felt this freedom, like it's in the Lord's hands. And I didn't even know that was driving me. And so we did eventually buy a house. But it was just very freeing to realize that I was being driven by this idea that I didn't even know.
Mhm.
And so this whole book is about kind of the things that maybe are in the evangelical community are kind of driving us and building our expectations. And they might be good, they might be bad, but we should at least look at them and say, oh, this is why we are the way we are.
Mhm.
And should we be this way?
Yeah. Well, and as I'm looking at the table of contents, I mean, I have so many questions and I cannot wait to dig into this book. It hasn't released yet, but by the time this thing airs, it's already been out a few months. And so I'm looking at some of the, descriptors that you have here of MLK, Dr. Pepper, Ebenezer Scrooge, what the Virgin Mary on grilled cheese. Okay. So I'm kind of curious. Was there a favorite chapter that you like, man, I loved writing this chapter. Is there one out of them, or is it kind of like teaching Bible study and whatever you're teaching the passage on, that's your favorite at the time?
Yeah, it was, I mean, a little of both. I would say that the chapter that kind of, it wasn't the first one I wrote, but it was the first one I thought of, and the one that was kind of in my mind and heart the whole time was the one on domesticity. And that is the one that, again, emerged from my class, specifically the poem that I mentioned, The Angel in the House, which I talk about in that chapter. And, I know there are a lot of Christians in our circles out there talking about masculinity, femininity, gender roles, huge hot topic. Yeah, right? Big votes on it. Already cast coming up, right? Okay. I didn't want to write about that. Like, I'm just so tired of that. Everyone else has had their say. But I did want to write, again, part of the kernel of this whole book was the separate spheres that women were placed in during the Victorian age, and how they were relegated to the private sphere. The men were in the public sphere. And obviously I'm not a very private person, and I have a public career. And so I wanted to write about it, but I didn't want to write about it in the same way everyone else is talking about it. And so I centered on the domestic life, which I think is something that is, people don't realize that the whole idea of the domestic life wasn't always around. I mean, when you were just like working in the fields all day and just had to go home at night to sleep, or just birthing your children and trying to stay alive and keep them alive and trying not to get the plague, you weren't really developing a robust kind of domestic life or idea about the domestic life. And the Victorian age, because it had so much economic and material prosperity, it was, a lot of more people were able to get the nice house and fill it with the nice furniture. And it was a big sign of success for a man to be able to have his wife at home and that she didn't have to work. And so the domestic sphere developed and thrived. And I happen to be someone who loves being home and having a home and working in my home and having a garden and having chickens and picking out the nice sofa that I can finally afford after all these years. Check out my Instagram for that. The dogs are all over it. But for me, it was a process of self-examination to say, I don't, I have a public life, I'm a professional, I have a career, but I still love my home life. And I love that that's a gift that I think evangelicalism gave us, is this emphasis on the home. It needs to be held in a healthy biblical way, and not in the way that I see a lot of people out there talking about, like when they tell the women to go home. That's not what we want. But this chapter was really important to me because it was personal, because I just love the domestic life, even as I love my professional life and working and teaching and writing and speaking.
Interesting. Okay. I don't know that I would have picked that, but I love your reason behind it. And even knowing you and your Instagram and pictures and your string lights with vines that are growing up. Like, I think it's reminders of simple things that make home, and not exactly kind of what you're contrasting it with that idea of the American dream and amassing a bunch of stuff or putting on a front in order to prove ourselves to one another. But it really is this sphere of influence and safety and respite that we get to offer not only to one another, but to the world and to people around us. So I love that. I love knowing that now. So when I read that chapter, I think there's going to be so many grins and flashbacks to your Instagram. Exactly. So Okay, we are running out of time. So let me kind of go here because you submitted this book draft like a while ago, right? And it's about to come out now. And I feel like for you, and as I watch you, friend, like there's just been a lot of shifting. There's been a lot of just redefining of, okay, what does career look like? What does life look like? And I think one of the words that I would describe you as is resilient. I mean, like a bus couldn't take you out. A pit bull could not chase you down and, hurt you. And I mean,
Well, it
just,
did, but I
well, it
survived.
did hurt. That's true. Lots of pain medication and prayers from family and friends. But I mean, like there is this physical pain and physical hardship that you have walked through. But then I have also seen just this resilience of you choosing God over everything else, no matter what comes at you. And it's something I hope for in my own life. And I've got a ways to go, but it's just such a beautiful picture, I think, of what a woman in leadership means when she's clinging to God and when God is sustaining her and when God is bringing her through even the hardest of times. And so I think I would love to know, like, what are you learning about God right now? And I think as things are kind of shifting and as you're even getting to breathe a little bit, maybe some in that respite time, like, what are you learning about him that's new, that is maybe even just, maybe it's a breath of fresh air. Maybe it's also just kind of a reckoning of just all that you have led through. And you're finally getting to kind of like process it, those kind of things. I know it's a vulnerable question, so I'll let you go with it where you want. But I think I'd like to know at least just how do you see him differently in this season?
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually want to answer first with something that's not so much different, but just really deeper now. And then I'll try to think of something different. But just that God is just so personal. And he, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I just, really through my whole life, but especially in this season, I have just seen him answer prayers and meet needs in such ways that I know it's him, and I know it's him, answering in a way that I need. So for example, one thing that I have prayed specifically about a few things in the past few years, especially in this tumultuous time, is because I'm often faced with, like, I want to do the right thing. And I want to, I don't believe that God has like the perfect blueprint for our lives. I believe that his will for our lives is in scripture. And that if we follow his will as revealed, we are free to do whatever, other options might be in front of us, as long as we're following his, revealed will. So that means, like, where we live or what job we have, or all those things. These are things he gives us freedom for, but we also need to make those decisions with wisdom and discernment. And so my prayer for God, whenever I'm like faced with a big decision or I'm not sure if I'm in the right path, is always just like, Lord, please make it clear. Please make it clear. Mm-hmm. Well, let me warn you, if you ask for clarity from the Lord, and if you're like me and you second guess everything, he will give you clear answers. And sometimes those are hard. But I also know it's like a mercy, because this is what I asked for. And I know he knows that's what I need, because I am such a second guesser, third guesser, fourth guesser. Did I do the right thing? Is this, yeah. And so the Lord knows I need to know that it was him, not me. And so I can just look at things, over the past several years and see he was working that way. Now, I don't know what he has for me in this next season, because it's like I've just reached, a fork in the road. But I really, I just completely believe he has something that I can't see yet. I can't imagine yet. But it's there, and I'm just like waiting, and I'm just moving slowly, but resting and letting him reveal it. And I feel such a sense of care from him, and peace that I think comes totally from him. It passes all understanding. And so, these are things I've been taught and believed all my life and experienced a little, but right now it's just so deep and so real. And so, yeah.
I love that. Yeah. And I think you've got a whole group of people that are believing that for you. And I can't wait to see. It really does feel like it's a front row seat of just seeing you watch God and love God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with actually practicing out this faith thing that we constantly talk about, but it's hard when the rubber hits the road of just trusting him, but then also just seeing how he is beautifully meeting your needs, like giving you and Roy time, and just I think these simple gratitudes of a daily run and the sunset or dog naps. I mean, it really is. It's such a I think foundational thing that so many of us miss because we're so busy, just walking past and saying that we're doing things for God, but very much missing him. And so I appreciate just your chase after him. I appreciate your obedience to be a Huldah for our generation, scars and all. And I hope you know just how much you are loved and we're cheering you on. Why don't you tell our listeners, like, how do they connect with you? How do they see these really cute pictures and, all the things? How do they learn from you?
Well, I'm on several social medias, Twitter, KS Pryor, Instagram, Karen Swallow Pryor, the new one, Threads, which is tied to Instagram. And then the most exciting part, by the time this comes out, I'll have been doing this for a little while, but as we're speaking, I haven't launched it yet, but I am starting a Substack newsletter, which I know everyone is doing. But I'm actually really excited about it because this is like, I'm seeing this as my new classroom. So you can subscribe to that for free, or you can be a supporter, and it's called The Priory.
I know. I love the name. When you said that, I was like, oh, it's perfect. So yes, I love that. Well, we'll make sure to put all of those links in the show notes. And if you're listening to this and you're not following her, you need to be, because there is so much wisdom, so much beauty, so much grace in this sister. So Karen, I love you. I'm thankful for you and so grateful to call you friend.
Thank you, Jackie.
And as always, I'm so grateful that y'all joined us for this season. I know you've been encouraged. I think you've probably been challenged and had your toes stepped on a little bit. But most importantly, I hope you see God in brighter and bigger ways, and that you chase him and give him your yes as you follow him in whatever sphere of influence you may have, because we have the beauty and the privilege of getting to image a really great God. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next season for another season of At the Table. We'll see you then.